When the avoidant waited for you to beg, but you stayed silent and this happened. There is a very specific kind of silence that changes everything between two people. Not the angry kind, not the dramatic kind, the kind that arrives after someone expected you to chase them and you didn't. The kind where they pull away expecting paragraphs, tears, emotional chaos, repeated phone calls, late-night confessions, and proof that they still matter to you more than your own dignity. But instead, your side of the screen stays dark. No emotional speeches, no desperate explanations, no please don't leave, just silence. And what makes this moment so powerful is that avoidants are often prepared for pain, but they are not prepared for absence. They know how to defend themselves against pressure. They know how to emotionally shut down when someone becomes too emotional, too needy, too reactive, but when you quietly disappear into your own peace instead of fighting for access to them, something strange begins happening inside them that they never expected. Because now they can't measure your attachment anymore. They can't feel your emotional energy reaching for them. They can't predict you. And unpredictability terrifies someone who survives through emotional control. So while they may look calm on the outside, internally the silence starts echoing louder every day. And if you've ever been in this position where you loved someone deeply, got pushed away, and then finally chose silence instead of self-abandonment, subscribe to the channel right now, because this entire video is going to feel less like entertainment and more like someone finally explaining the emotional reality nobody talks about. The truth is, many avoidants do not pull away because they fully want you gone forever. That's the part people misunderstand. Sometimes distance is their way of testing emotional safety without directly admitting they need reassurance. Instead of saying, "I'm scared you'll leave me," they create emotional space and subconsciously wait to see whether you panic, whether you chase, whether you fight harder for them. It sounds contradictory because it is contradictory. Their deepest fear is emotional engulfment, but their second deepest fear is emotional abandonment. So they live trapped between wanting closeness and wanting escape at the exact same time. And when someone keeps chasing after they withdraw, it temporarily soothes both fears. The avoidant gets distance while still feeling emotionally desired. They get to disappear without fully losing access to your love. That becomes the emotional pattern, the cycle. Push away, watch you chase, feel validated, repeat. But this time, you didn't play your role in the cycle anymore. You stayed silent, and your silence created something they were never emotionally prepared for: uncertainty. Suddenly, they don't know if you're crying over them or healing without them. They don't know if you're waiting or slowly detaching. They don't know whether your love was unconditional or finally exhausted, and that unknown becomes psychologically unbearable because avoidants rely heavily on emotional predictability to feel safe. When you stop reacting, you quietly remove the emotional map they depended on. At first, though, they convince themselves your silence means nothing. This is important to understand. In the beginning, the avoidant often feels relief, space, freedom. Their nervous system calms down because the emotional intensity disappears. No difficult conversations, no vulnerability, no pressure to explain themselves. They lean into distractions, work, routines, social media, hobbies, random conversations, anything that helps them avoid sitting still long enough to feel what's actually happening underneath. And during these early days, they fully expect you to break first. They expect the late-night message, they expect the emotional reach-out, they expect to reopen the door whenever they feel ready and still find you standing there emotionally available. Because in the past, maybe you always were. So initially, your silence gets misread as temporary. They tell themselves they just need time, but then something starts shifting, slowly, quietly. Days pass, then more days, still nothing. No emotional explosion, no attempt to force reconnection, and the silence starts feeling different now. Heavier, less like temporary space and more like emotional absence. That's when relief starts transforming into curiosity. And curiosity for avoidance is dangerous because curiosity opens emotional doors they usually keep locked. Now their mind starts wandering back toward you in moments they can't control, while driving, while lying awake at night, while scrolling aimlessly. They begin checking indirectly, watching stories without interacting, looking for hidden meanings in your online activity, wondering whether certain posts are about them, replaying your old conversations in their head. And this part is rarely visible to outsiders because avoidants often process attachment privately and internally. They do not always express longing openly. In fact, the more emotionally affected they are, the quieter they sometimes become. But internally, the silence begins creating emotional static they cannot switch off anymore. Because your absence forces them to confront something uncomfortable. Your emotional presence had become part of their stability. The warmth you gave them, the consistency, the availability, the emotional reassurance they acted casual about receiving. It mattered more than they admitted. And now that it's gone, they notice the empty spaces it used to fill. Suddenly, the relationship starts feeling emotionally clearer in hindsight than it did while they were inside it. And this is where the avoidant begins experiencing something they secretly hate: loss without closure. Because your silence leaves them alone with their own thoughts instead of allowing them to focus on managing your reactions. What makes silence so psychologically powerful with avoidance is that confrontation actually helps them maintain their defenses. Think about it. If you beg, cry, argue, or demand answers, their brain immediately shifts into protection mode. Walls go up, distance increases, emotional shutdown activates, but silence removes the emotional target completely. There is nothing left to defend against. No pressure to escape, no emotional noise drowning out their own feelings, just them and the uncomfortable reality they were trying not to feel. That is why silence often reaches avoidance more deeply than emotional pursuit ever could, because now for the first time they are forced to experience the full emotional weight of your absence without distraction. And the strangest part is that your silence begins changing how they see you. Before, they may have unconsciously assumed your love would always remain accessible no matter how distant they became, but now your calmness starts looking powerful, your restraint starts looking attractive, your absence starts feeling real. And deep down, something shifts inside them when they realize you are no longer emotionally available on command. That realization shakes them because it forces them to confront a possibility they never prepared for. Maybe the person they expected to beg is actually learning how to live without them. And once that realization enters an avoidance mind, even briefly, the emotional balance between you starts changing in ways they cannot fully control anymore. Because now the silence is no longer just silence, it becomes a mirror. Every unanswered moment begins reflecting back the emotional truths they spent so long avoiding. They start noticing how often they expected you to carry the emotional weight of the relationship, how often they disappeared emotionally while still expecting your loyalty to remain untouched. And this awareness doesn't arrive all at once like some dramatic movie scene. It arrives quietly, in fragments, a random memory while hearing a familiar song, a moment of emptiness after laughing with other people and still feeling disconnected. A strange ache when they realize nobody else understood them the way you did. Avoidants are experts at suppressing emotions while relationships are active because closeness activates fear in them. But distance changes the environment completely. Once the relationship energy is gone, once your emotional presence is no longer constantly available, attachment starts surfacing in delayed waves, and the silence you gave them becomes the exact space where those feelings finally have room to breathe. That's the irony people don't talk about enough. The avoidant often feels your absence more deeply after you stop reaching for them than while you were actively loving them. At the same time, another battle begins inside them, one between pride and attachment. Pride tells them to stay distant. Pride reminds them that reconnecting means vulnerability. It means admitting they care. It means risking emotional exposure after spending so long protecting themselves from exactly that. But attachment does not disappear simply because someone avoids it. Attachment waits, quietly, patiently, and eventually it starts speaking louder than their defenses. Suddenly they find themselves wanting to check whether you're still accessible emotionally, wanting proof that the door isn't fully closed. And what makes this so emotionally confusing for avoidants is that they often mistake emotional dependency for weakness, so the more they feel pulled toward someone, the more conflicted they become internally. One part of them misses you deeply, another part resists needing anyone at all. That contradiction creates emotional tension they don't know how to regulate properly. So instead of directly expressing vulnerability, they often move indirectly. They lurk, they observe, they think about reaching out 10 times before actually doing it once. Because silence has now forced them into unfamiliar territory where they are no longer reacting from control but from uncertainty, and uncertainty activates attachment wounds and avoidance more than people realize. Then comes the loneliness, not surface-level loneliness, not boredom, real emotional loneliness. The kind that creeps in after distractions stop working. Because when you were there, even if they acted emotionally detached sometimes, your presence created a form of emotional grounding in their life. Your messages, your energy, your consistency, your emotional availability, it became part of their nervous system's background comfort. Human beings adapt quickly to emotional safety even when they pretend they don't need it, and avoidants are no exception. The difference is that they usually recognize the value of emotional safety only after it disappears. So now they begin noticing the silence in ordinary moments, nobody checking on them the way you did, nobody noticing small changes in their mood, nobody emotionally reaching toward them with patience and familiarity. And this is where many avoidants begin replaying the relationship differently in their mind. While the relationship was active, their focus may have stayed locked onto pressure, expectations, vulnerability, or fear of losing independence. But after silence settles in, the brain often starts filtering memories through loss instead of fear. Suddenly they remember your softness more vividly, your effort, your understanding, the way you stayed emotionally present even when they struggled to reciprocate consistently. And the painful part for them is realizing too late how emotionally rare that actually was. That replaying process becomes almost obsessive in quiet moments. Old conversations start sounding different in hindsight. Things they dismissed emotionally before now hit them with delayed meaning. Maybe they remember moments where you tried to communicate calmly while they withdrew, moments where you gave reassurance while secretly needing reassurance yourself, moments where your patience was mistaken for emotional weakness instead of emotional maturity. And because avoidants struggle to process emotions in real time, they often don't fully understand the emotional significance of relationships until distance creates clarity. That's why silence becomes so psychologically intense for them. It removes emotional overstimulation and leaves them alone with reflection. And reflection can become unbearable when someone starts realizing they may have pushed away the very person who loved them most consistently. But instead of openly admitting this realization, many avoidants begin testing emotional access carefully. Small actions, indirect signals, maybe a random reaction to a story after weeks of silence, a casual check-in that feels emotionally colder than what they actually feel inside. A message disguised as friendliness when it's really anxiety underneath. Because they are trying to answer one terrifying question without directly asking it, do I still have access to you? And this is where your continued silence or even your calmness starts transforming the entire dynamic completely. Because if you respond differently now, if your energy feels lighter, calmer, less emotionally desperate, the avoidant immediately notices it. They may not say it out loud, but they feel the shift deeply. The person who once over-explained, overgave, and overreached emotionally is no longer operating from fear of loss, and that changes everything psychologically. Because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but they are also deeply affected by emotional absence when attachment exists underneath. Your calmness communicates something powerful without saying a single word. You are no longer abandoning yourself to keep them comfortable. And for many avoidants, this becomes the moment real panic quietly begins forming beneath the surface. Not because you yelled, not because you demanded closure, but because your silence forced them to confront the possibility that you are emotionally moving forward without needing their validation anymore. And that possibility feels far more threatening than any argument ever could. Because underneath the calm exterior avoidance tries so hard to maintain, silence has now started activating emotions they buried for years, sometimes even long before you ever entered their life. That is the deeper reason your silence affects them so intensely. It is not just about missing you. It is about finally losing the distractions that help them avoid themselves. When relationships are active, avoidance can focus on external things, the pressure, the expectations, the fear of vulnerability, the need for space. But when the relationship energy disappears and your emotional pursuit stops completely, they are left alone with their own internal world. And for someone who has spent years surviving through emotional suppression, that internal world can feel overwhelming. Suddenly, emotions they kept compartmentalized begin surfacing all at once: regret, longing, fear, nostalgia, shame, emotional dependence, vulnerability, feelings they spent years convincing themselves they did not need to feel. Your silence becomes the environment where all of those emotions finally echo loud enough to be heard. And this is why avoidants often look emotionally unaffected in the beginning but unravel internally much later. Their emotional processing is delayed because protection comes first and reflection comes second. By the time they truly begin understanding what they lost, the other person is often already healing. And once that delayed emotional awakening starts happening, something almost tragic begins unfolding inside them. They start romanticizing the relationship in ways they never allowed themselves to while they still had access to it. Little moments suddenly feel emotionally enormous in hindsight. The way you checked on them without being asked, the patience you showed during their emotional shutdowns, the safety they felt sitting beside you during ordinary moments they barely appreciated at the time. Human beings often fail to recognize emotional security while living inside it because familiarity makes valuable things feel permanent. Avoidants are especially vulnerable to this because their fear of closeness constantly distracts them from the closeness they actually crave. So now, in your absence, memories begin softening around the edges. Their brain stops focusing only on fear and starts focusing on comfort. And comfort is dangerous for avoidants to revisit emotionally because it exposes how deeply attached they actually became beneath all the distance. They may replay your laugh in their mind unexpectedly, reread old messages they once ignored casually, revisit places, songs, routines, or tiny details connected to you, and the silence makes every memory louder because there is no new emotional interaction interrupting the reflection anymore. This is often the stage where avoidants begin realizing that your love was not suffocating them the way they once convinced themselves it was. In reality, it may have been one of the few emotionally stable things they ever experienced. Then comes the stage they fear the most, the realization that you might actually move on. Not theoretically, not emotionally, halfway, truly move on. And this realization tends to hit avoidants suddenly rather than gradually. Maybe they notice your energy feels different when you finally do interact. Maybe they sense emotional detachment in your tone. Maybe they see signs that your life is continuing without them at the emotional center anymore. And for the first time, they are no longer reacting to your pursuit, they are reacting to your absence becoming permanent. This is where emotional panic often starts quietly taking over internally, because many avoidants subconsciously believe emotional access will remain available indefinitely even after distance, conflict, or withdrawal. They expect the connection to pause, not disappear. But once they feel the emotional door slowly closing for real, attachment fear suddenly becomes stronger than intimacy fear. The same person who once avoided emotional closeness now feels terrified by emotional loss. And this creates enormous internal confusion because avoidants are not used to seeing themselves as emotionally dependent on anyone. So when they begin feeling anxiety over losing you permanently, their identity starts conflicting with their emotions. Part of them still wants to maintain distance and emotional control. Another part desperately wants reassurance that they have not lost you forever. That internal contradiction creates emotional chaos they rarely know how to express in healthy ways. This is why avoidants often return in emotionally confusing ways rather than direct vulnerability. Sometimes they come back softly, carefully, indirectly. A random message that feels strangely casual considering the emotional weight underneath it. A small interaction designed to test whether warmth still exists between you. They may avoid discussing the relationship directly at first because direct vulnerability still feels threatening. But underneath those small actions is often fear. Fear that they waited too long, fear that your silence changed you permanently, fear that you no longer emotionally need them the way you once did. And this is where an important distinction has to be understood, because not every return means emotional growth. Some avoidants return because loneliness hurts. Some return because they miss emotional access, comfort, validation, or familiarity. But others return because silence forced them into genuine self-confrontation. Those are two very different realities. One wants relief from pain, the other wants transformation. One seeks to restore emotional comfort without changing the pattern. The other begins recognizing the pattern itself as the problem, and the difference becomes visible in accountability, in consistency, in emotional honesty, in whether they can finally sit inside vulnerability without running the second intimacy becomes real again. Because the truth is, silence itself does not manipulate avoidance. Silence simply removes the emotional noise that once protected them from fully feeling the consequences of distance. That is what makes it so powerful. You stopped forcing awareness onto them externally, so awareness had to develop internally instead. And internal realizations always hit deeper than arguments ever do. Nobody convinced them to miss you, nobody pressured them into valuing you. Your absence allowed reality to speak without interruption, and reality becomes difficult to ignore when someone realizes they lost a connection that felt emotionally rare. Especially when they begin noticing how emotionally exhausting surface-level interactions with other people feel compared to the depth, safety, and understanding they once had with you. Because people often think avoidants do not feel deeply, but that is rarely true. Many of them feel too deeply. The problem is not absence of emotion. The problem is fear of emotional dependence, fear of vulnerability, fear of losing themselves inside closeness. But silence changes the emotional equation completely. It removes the immediate fear of intimacy and replaces it with the heavier reality of loss. And sometimes that is the first moment an avoidant truly sees the relationship clearly. And while all of this is happening inside the avoidant, something equally important is happening inside you too. That is the part people overlook when they talk about silence. They focus entirely on whether the avoidant misses you, returns, regrets things, or finally wakes up emotionally. But silence changes the person who stayed silent just as much as the person being left behind by it. Because in the beginning, your silence may have felt forced, heavy, painful. Every instinct inside you probably wanted to reach out, explain yourself one more time, ask whether they cared, fight for clarity, fight for reassurance, fight for the relationship itself. You were not silent because you stopped loving them instantly. You were silent because constantly chasing someone emotionally was slowly destroying your sense of self. And at first, the silence hurts because it removes your usual coping mechanism too. No more checking whether they replied, no more trying to decode mixed signals, no more emotional bargaining. Just you sitting alone with your own attachment, your own grief, your own emptiness. But then, little by little, something begins shifting inside you. The same silence that forced the avoidant into reflection begins rebuilding you from the inside out. You start noticing how much energy you spent trying to keep the connection alive almost entirely on your own. You start recognizing how often you abandon your own emotional needs just to maintain closeness with someone emotionally unavailable. And the painful part is realizing that love alone was never the issue. You loved deeply, you cared genuinely, you stayed patient longer than most people would have. But somewhere along the way, your love became mixed with self-erasure. You became so focused on proving your worth to someone emotionally distant that you stopped protecting your own peace. And silence interrupts that cycle. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. One day you wake up and realize you did not check your phone the second you opened your eyes. Another day passes and you notice their absence no longer ruins your entire mood. Then eventually you begin reconnecting with parts of yourself that got buried beneath emotional anxiety. Your routines stabilize, your mind quiets down, you laugh without forcing it. You stop rehearsing imaginary conversations in your head. You stop needing constant emotional confirmation to feel okay. And this is where the transformation becomes real, because silence stops being a strategy to get them back and starts becoming the space where you finally return to yourself. Ironically, this is often the exact stage where the avoidant feels your emotional shift most intensely, because your energy no longer reaches toward them with desperation. There is no emotional pulling anymore, no silent begging hidden beneath your words. And avoidants are extremely sensitive to changes in emotional accessibility. They can feel when someone is emotionally detaching for real. It changes the entire atmosphere between you. The person they once expected to wait forever is now emotionally standing on their own feet. And for many avoidants, this realization creates a level of grief they never anticipated. Because now they understand something too late. Your constant emotional presence was never guaranteed. It was a gift, a deeply human gift. Your patience, your understanding, your willingness to stay emotionally open despite inconsistency, and when that gift disappears, they often begin seeing your value with painful clarity. But by this stage, your relationship with yourself is changing too. You are no longer measuring your worth through their ability to choose you consistently. You are no longer begging to be emotionally prioritized. And this is why silence becomes transformative instead of manipulative. It is not about punishing someone into loving you. It is about finally refusing to abandon yourself in order to hold on to someone else. And sometimes the avoidant does come back after this shift. Sometimes they return softer, more emotionally aware, more honest about the fears that controlled them. Sometimes silence truly becomes the thing that breaks through years of emotional avoidance because loss finally forces self-awareness into the open. But even then, something inside you has changed permanently. You no longer look at love the same way. You no longer confuse emotional inconsistency with depth. You no longer romanticize being the only one fighting for connection. Because silence taught you something difficult but necessary. Love should not require you to constantly prove your worth to someone who only values your presence once they feel your absence. And that lesson changes the way you move forever. It changes the standards you hold, the boundaries you keep, the energy you tolerate. You begin understanding that real emotional security does not leave you starving for reassurance while giving endless understanding in return. Real connection does not constantly make you question whether asking for basic emotional consistency is too much. And once you truly internalize that, you stop shrinking yourself emotionally just to stay connected to people who fear intimacy more than they value love. That is why the ending of this story is so emotionally complicated. Because sometimes the avoidant finally understands your value at the exact moment you no longer need them to understand it anymore. That is the tragedy hidden inside so many avoidant dynamics. The clarity arrives late. Delayed by fear, delayed by emotional suppression, delayed by the belief that love would remain accessible no matter how much distance existed. But silence changes timelines. It forces growth on both sides. The avoidant is forced to confront emotions they spent years outrunning, and you are forced to confront the ways you abandoned yourself trying to hold on to someone emotionally unavailable. And by the time both people finally see the truth clearly, the emotional landscape has already changed. Because the silence that once felt unbearable became the very thing that healed you. It taught you how to sit with loneliness without collapsing, how to stop over-explaining your worth, how to stop chasing people who only felt safe loving you from a distance. And maybe the most powerful part of all this is realizing that your silence was never empty. It was full of transformation, full of grief turning into self-respect, full of attachment turning into awareness, full of emotional chaos slowly becoming peace. So if you are in that silence right now, wondering whether they miss you, whether they regret things, whether they are secretly thinking about you while pretending not to care, understand this. Sometimes the greatest shift is not the avoidant finally waking up emotionally. Sometimes the greatest shift is you finally realizing that your value existed long before they learned how to recognize it. And once that realization settles into your spirit deeply enough, you stop begging for love that requires self-betrayal to maintain. You stop trying to earn emotional consistency from people committed to emotional distance. You stop making someone else's confusion your responsibility to solve, because silence eventually teaches something that heartbreak never could. The moment you stopped chasing them was the moment you finally started finding yourself again.